Okay, here we are reading more about the Environmental Protection Agency of the US because the book is focused on the US. As we said, Richard Nixon established it. The EPA helps set environmental policy after Congress passes an environmental law. The EPA figures out the rules and regulations needed to follow the new law. Climate change falls under the Clean Air Act of 1970 that allows the Environmental Protection Agency or the EPA to set limits on emissions from factories and cars and more. So they will say what the efficiency of the cars should be and what emission should be allowed, why you should get your car tested for emissions every couple of years or so, and so on and so forth. And they are always getting into trouble because the industries and factories are fighting the rules and regulations, and some politicians are helping the factories rather than helping the EPA, and so on and so forth. And I will show that next slide, I think, is a chart about how the entire world is now having more and more environmental regulations. But as I mentioned in the last podcast, you can have lots of rules, but if they are not being enforced, let's say you're eating too many candies and your mom keeps saying it's bad for you, stop eating candies, but she doesn't prevent you from getting candies and eating them. So your mom may be saying it's bad, but your father may be giving you some money that you can spend as you want, and you keep buying chocolate and candies. Then the advice from the mother is not very useful. Then she may set a rule saying you will not eat more than a certain number of candies in a week or in a month or something, and then again she has to make sure that you are following the rule and so on. So the rule doesn't make any difference if it just exists, unless factories and cars are made to follow the rules, right? So an environmental movement started growing and groups formed with the idea to protect the planet. Worldwide conferences were held on the need to protect the environment. Pollution was being noticed everywhere. Health impacts were being documented everywhere, and these were led by the United Nations. You may know already what the UN is. If not, you can follow up. So this is an international organization that started in some form after the Second World War in the 1940s, and UN works toward common goals among many countries. So whenever there are conflicts of some sort across national boundaries, then people go to the UN to talk about it, seek justice, and try to get regulations made and help the poor countries, and so on and so forth. So here is the nice tall building in New York City of the United Nations headquarters. UN offices are everywhere. UN is split into many agencies that focus on education and culture and climate and economies and environment and development, and so on and so forth. At the very first UN environmental meeting in 1972, climate change gained attention. Remember our good old David Keeling curve? The Keeling curve showed by 1970s very clearly that the CO2 was increasing, and it was being measured more and more, and the temperature data was coming in, and it was clear that temperatures were beginning to warm, and some bad weathers were being related to warming as well in many ways. The focus was on air and water pollution, though. In this 1972 meeting, the group also warned governments to watch out for activities that could lead to warming. So they had an eye on the warming, but they were focused on air and water pollution. Right now you hear a lot about pollution because it kills a lot of people every year prematurely, so people die before they are ready, health wise they should be living longer. Premature deaths, dying before your time is up. And then there's all the discussion about climate change. Going back to the timelines, then in the 1980s, scientists made a startling discovery. There was a huge hole in the protective layer of the atmosphere. You may have heard of it. jump up and say, yes, it's the ozone hole. Chemicals used in certain types of spray cans, like those for hairsprays, were destroying the ozone layer. The ozone layer is part of the upper atmosphere, as we learned before, and has a high level of protective gas called ozone. Without it, harmful sun's rays could reach Earth, and all animals and all people are going to be hurt if ozone hole doesn't close, right? So these chemicals went up into the upper atmosphere, and you by now remember, you are an expert. Where is the ozone? It's not in the troposphere so much. There is some, but that's a pollution. In the stratosphere, the UV radiation is splitting oxygen molecules into oxygen atoms, and oxygen atoms are combining with oxygen molecules and producing ozone, which is O3, the chemical formula. If you don't know, don't worry about it. You will learn it later in the chemistry. But once ozone is formed, it absorbs a lot of the UV that is harmful to us and protects us at the surface from the UV that shouldn't come into the surface at all. So some people won the Nobel Prize for this great discovery of the chemical reactions that cause the ozone hole, and a Montreal protocol was set in place to reduce the production of material that were harming the ozone hole. So ozone hole has recovered somewhat since then, but it continues to struggle still. Okay. Then came President Ronald Reagan, who was from the Republican Party, and he signed a treaty with dozens of other nations to ban the chemicals that were harming the ozone hole. The plan worked. The hole is closing, but sometimes not as fast or as completely as we would want. At the same time, the concern about climate change was growing around the world. In 1998, under the Democratic President Bill Clinton, the United States signed an agreement called the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto is a place in Japan famous for its temple and the Fuji mountain and so on. Almost 200 countries agreed to reduce emissions by at least 5% below the levels they were at in 1990. There are details as to why 1990 was picked as the baseline. You can read up on it. We looked at the timelines before. So here is a schematic of the ozone hole. Here is sun's rays coming in, and some rays are reflected, and some rays are reflected, but some are getting through. And if that's the ozone hole, then the UV radiation, ultraviolet radiation, which is very bad for our DNA, our life forms, can get through, and that's dangerous. So ozone layer is protecting us, but if you make a hole, then everybody, including all the other species, will be in trouble. Even plants and agricultural crops suffer if there is too much UV. Okay, so we'll maybe stop here and talk about the Kyoto Protocol in the next podcast. Basically, we are talking about the US, but actually what happened, the UN and many countries, especially the European countries, were saying we must do something. They brought together many climate scientists, social scientists, economists, and so on together in a framework called the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which started a group of scientists called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which started doing climate modeling. Remember, we looked at the models before and said it does the historical past with the past greenhouse gases and volcanoes, and the models can project the future climate change and CO2 increase once we tell it how we may behave, whether we will have more and more renewable energy and electric vehicles and carbon capture and so on and so forth, and whether we will reduce emissions or continue to increase and so on. So it's not just that United States went and signed the Kyoto Protocol. There was a lot of work done, and sad news, as we'll see later in the next podcast, is that the next president that came along said, I don't believe in climate change, and Kyoto Protocol will actually negatively affect the economy of the United States. This is a key point to remember, because everybody may want to do something about climate, but they say, first, let me worry about my bank account, my country's future, my country's economy, and that depends on producing things and consuming things and selling things. So I will wait on this climate change thing, right? So priorities always shift. It's like saying again the candy story. Mom is saying don't eat candies, it's bad for you, and maybe you eat a candy and your stomach doesn't feel so good, but you say, well, let me continue and see what happens, right? So you like candy and you will ignore the warnings that you are getting. So similar things happen when countries try to negotiate the climate change action and so on, because it's a global problem, as you learned by now. Just one country trying to do something may not help as much, so all the countries together have to come together. And you also learn that the CO2 is increasing and increasing and increasing. So even though we have Kyoto Protocol and now we have the Paris Agreement, emissions are not decreasing, which means we are still struggling to reduce the emissions. Okay, so we'll continue the discussion in the next podcast on this.